All right, everyone, let's do this. How are you? Welcome to this week's episode of our podcast. It's called Is Breakfast Included? Thanks for stopping by. On the show this week, we sit down and talk with former music executive turned author Howie Abrams. Howie has written 10 books since 2013. His most recent will be released September 10th. It's an autobiography entitled Vinny Stigma, the most interesting man in the world. You can pre-order it now. This was a great conversation. Howie has several great stories, and then we really get into the book about Vinny Stigma, who is the founding member of Agnostic Front, New York hardcore legends. I encourage you to check this out and go pre-order your copy of the book. It was a lot of fun doing this, and like I said, Howie was just a great guest. Let's check it out. All right, buddy, tell everyone who you are, what you do, where you're from.
Yeah, so Howie Abrams from New York City, and worked in the music business at record labels and music publishing companies for many, many years. And then when that really started to crumble, had to figure out what the heck to do with myself. And since that time, I've been writing books, and I have my 10th book since 2013 coming out in September, which is Vinny Stigma from Agnostic Front's autobiography, The Most Interesting Man in the World.
Right on, man. Right on. What labels did you work for?
So I started out working for a distribution company called Important, which was at the time the biggest independent record distributor in the country. So they worked with all kinds of independent labels, and the name Important ultimately came from them bringing in a lot of imports and selling them mostly to like mom and pop shops in America.
Yeah.
And that was an umbrella company, Important, for also two record labels, which at the time I started there, I was a salesperson, was Relativity Records and also Combat Records. So Relativity Records was Joe Satriani was the big artist at the
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and then Combat Records was a metal label, pretty steeped in death metal and thrash, and they had a small imprint prior to that called Combat Core, which had some hardcore bands and things. And Agnostic Front was actually on that label, Combat Core. So then after that label, which I was at for 5 years, I went and worked at Roadrunner Records, where I did A&R and marketing. And then I worked at Jive Records and Zomba Publishing for 10 years. And then I had a horrible experience at Warner Music for 2 years. And then it was time to be done working at the labels.
Right on, man. Well, you've made this transition from music business executive to author. All that is what inspired you. Like, did you know what you were going to do when you left the music business?
Zero. In between those things, it was like a real, well, now what, And I worked a bunch of day jobs. I worked at friggin' Home Depot. I did all kinds of things just trying to figure out, what really should be next.
Yeah.
And so a good friend of mine who I've known for a billion years and who I've been working on, especially the children's books with, Caves, who's an old graffiti guys and Lords of Brooklyn.
Mhm.
Um, he was also a tattooer, and he had a shop out in Brooklyn and Bay Ridge, where he's from. But he was also trying to transition his like illegal art into, sort of a legal path. And at the time is when you started hearing the term like street art as opposed to graffiti, which
Yeah.
was a way for people to like polish it up, I guess, and make it sound a lot less vandal. And Caves had been arrested for his graffiti and all that. But, there were a lot of companies that were looking for quote unquote street artists. And so what I did while I worked with him at his tattoo shop is we started to help transition him into working with some of these companies where he could do sort of legal, graffiti style stuff. And it worked really, really well. I mean, he did like the Beaujolais Nouveau wine label one year. He worked with Gretsch Guitars. He worked with whatchamacallit, He worked with some car companies, but he had designed logos prior for like Adidas and the Beastie Boys and, things like that.
Yeah.
And so he basically, was like primed and ready to do this. And that's when it worked. And then he and I, while we were in there together every day, we had come up with this idea first for what ultimately became our book, Hip Hop Alphabet, which is a children's book doing like the ABCs of like hip hop culture, not just artists, but like the elements, right? So DJing, graffiti, MCing, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so we did like a proposal for it and nobody gave a shit. So we basically like we gave it to agents, to publishers, whatever. People didn't understand it because they were trying to figure out, is this a children's book? Is it really for the parents? Is it blah blah blah? And we were like, well, it's for both. Like, is this really that difficult a concept, right? So it sat, and the proposal just sat there and sat there. And in the meantime, we were both good friends with a guy named Sasha Jenkins, who had a magazine back in the day called Ego Trip, which later became Mass Appeal. And so, which is now a record label and a production company and all these things. And so he did a book a while back called The Book of Rap Lists, which was like, if you're a fan of hip hop, it's the minutia, right? So it's every crazy little thing you could think of. And I was like, and I love the book. And I was like, and we love Sasha too, which was another thing. So I was like, there's only really one other genre of music you could do that with, and that's metal.
Yeah.
Because metal fans love minutia, right? They love to argue and fight about best, worst, guitar tones,
Yeah.
album covers. It's everything, right? Like there's no stone left unturned. So
Ozzy or Ronnie.
all of it, right? Like,
Yeah.
so that's an easy one, right?
Yeah.
That's like a one you hear all the time,
Yeah.
Diano, Dickinson, like it's
Yeah.
crazy. So I approached him and I was like, I love that book. And what do you think about, doing a metal version of it with me? So we wound up doing that book, and it was just sort of a whimsical idea, and he was already an author. He was doing books. He had done quite a few books, real deal author style, and I'd never done this. I'd written for some fanzines and things like that. But I was like, what do we do? And he's like, all right, I'll introduce you to my agent. He had a literary agent. So we went and met him. He told us what kind of proposal to put together. And we did like sort of like 10 pages. Like, here's what, the book would look like. Here's a whole bunch of other lists we would do and, stuff like that. And we got a deal within like 3 weeks. And ironically, it was with a company called Abrams Image, which is people are like, oh, is that your family? And I was like, no, it's not my family. They do the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books, actually.
Okay.
They're real deal. And we got this deal and we did the book, and it was really, really well received. I mean, people were attracted to different lists in the book, and, we get a call, or the publicist got a call from the New York Times, and they were like, yeah, we want to do something on the most embarrassing album covers list. And we're like, okay. So I had a whole like Sunday New York Times arts and leisure section, 2 pages on that list.
On that one list.
Yeah. And they put all these, terrible album covers like in the Times in color and stuff, which is amazing because it's really mostly black and white.
Yeah.
And it just sort of happened, right? And then that was done. We sort of like had our cycle with that for a year or whatever. And then I get a call from this agent who represented Sasha, and he's like, so what's next? I'm like, there's no next. I was like, I'm not really thinking about next at all. And he's like, well, there's a project that's looking for an author, and I think you'd be really good for it. I was like, well, you care to tell me what it is? And he's like, well, Kevin Lyman, who created the Warped Tour, is looking for someone to do a 20th anniversary of Warped Tour. So I was like, okay, well, the good news is I know Kevin quite well.
Yeah.
So, I've had dinner at his house, you know what I mean? So like, and I've had a million bands play Warped Tour. So can you let him know that I'm in the mix and I'd be really interested in talking to him about it? So long and short, I got the book, right?
Yeah.
So that was next. And that was book number 2. And then slowly but surely, I started to come up with my own, sort of targets to do books, people to do books with. And we even got to put out, Hip Hop Alphabet eventually, 7 years later.
Right on, man. Did that feel good to finally put it out?
Yeah, because like, it sucks being told no, and we felt it was no for dumb reasons, like that it was just sort of a lot of very, uncreative, not so forward thinking people. And we
Yeah.
were like, we think this is a great idea. Like, there's just so many times you can read, the classics to your kid. And I think we're of the generation now where like there's a lot of parents and even grandparents who grew up on all this music that we love.
Yeah.
And, it's something for them to enjoy reading to their kids and grandkids. And I think like that was the point,
Yeah.
and so and it got a great reaction, right? To the point where they asked us to do a volume two. So there's a Hip Hop Alphabet two. And then, I might as well tell this story. So then I'm friends with the day-to-day manager for Metallica, right?
Yeah.
And from years ago in the music business. And I was going out to San Francisco with my family just to go like on a vacation. And I hit him up and I said, "Hey, I'm going to be near you. Like, let's get together, And also, selfishly, I wanted to see Metallica HQ. And so I was
Who
like,
wouldn't?
can I come to your office? I want to see the whole operation. And he's like, sure. So we set a time, like we'll have coffee in the morning, whatever, at Metallica HQ. So I spoke to Caves and I said, look, I'm going out, to Northern California and I'm going to see him. If we have any designs on ever doing like one of these with a band, right? Why don't we do a page, a Metallica page? So we did an Ellis for Lars Ulrich page. And I don't have to do research. I'm a massive Metallica fan. Like I knew everything I needed to know. I didn't have to look it up. So we wrote like, like an 8-line rhyme or,
Yeah.
maybe it was 12 lines actually. It was really long about Lars, right? And Caves did an illustration. And I made like a laser print, of this thing we did, which I didn't even print out till I got to San Francisco because we weren't finished with it. So I went to see the guy and he's like, "Hey, you're doing really cool stuff with those Hip Hop Alphabet books. Have you ever thought of doing something more rock?" I'm like, "Well,
Let
funny
me
you
pull
mentioned."
this out.
I'm like, like here it is. And he's like grinning ear to ear. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, this is good. And he's like, I love it. And I think the guys are going to love it. And I'm like, okay. I was like, what's now? He goes, I'll show it to them. And he goes, I'm going out to Europe. They were in Europe at the time. And I'm going to bring it with me and I'm going to show it to them. And like a couple of weeks later, I got a call from him, like, you want to make a Metallica children's book, and that
Yeah.
worked out fucking great. And that's been my most successful to date.
Oh,
And they were
really?
incredible partners, like
Yeah.
amazing, like they're on tour in Europe and like within 36 hours, you got an answer on anything you needed to know. So, we had to show them illustrations and we had to pick the 26 letters and, do all this stuff. But I wanted to do it from a very, again, you have to be a real fan to like get some of what's in the book and
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
it's very obvious, right?
Yeah.
Um, and we did it and it just fucking blew up. Like it did really, really well. And everybody was really happy. And, the last time I went to see them out here in MetLife, they totally took care of me, snake pit, like the whole thing.
I know,
And,
right?
and I, I've been a fan since the No Life to Leather demo. I saw them in '83 open for Venom, you know what I mean? So it's like, and I still love them, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, sure, there's been some hiccups along the road, but at the same time, like they're just one of my favorite bands ever and
Yeah. Yeah.
will be. And so to work with them was incredible.
Yeah. I feel they're one of those bands kind of like AC/DC, like they've earned the right to have those hiccups.
Of course, they can
And
do whatever they want.
even their hiccups are better than half the shit out there.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like,
In my opinion, because they're one of my
yeah,
favorite bands too.
right. And you can revisit some of the things you didn't like when they came out and whatever.
Yeah.
And you even find merit in them later down the road, which is
Yeah.
kind of cool.
Yeah.
And it's like because you dismiss it sometimes, like Load comes out, right? And you're just like, eh.
Yeah.
But I think it was more that the image change too that went along with it that bugged me so much.
Yeah.
In fact, in the Merciless Book of Metal Lists, which I think is so funny because I was worried about this. I thought this was going to keep me from getting that book. Um, was we did something called like all the merits of Metallica's Load and Reload, and it's 2 blank pages. So in the book, there's just 2 blank pages to represent Load and Reload.
Yeah.
This is
It's
pre Lulu, you know?
yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh, it's funny because a few years ago, I went back and listened to those albums. I'm like, man, these are not bad. But
No, they're not bad.
at the time, I was like, this is not Metallica.
Right. I was just turned off. And then, like I said, the image changed along with it. And you're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
like
And
you
one of
see
my
what,
favorite songs from them is on one of those, Memory Remains. Like
yeah.
that
And they
song
still
is,
play those songs. They still
yeah.
play quite a few of those songs
Yeah.
live. I mean, because they play for 2 hours, they can't like ignore it. And,
Yeah.
some of those songs are pretty good, but I had so much baggage about it,
Yeah.
that I couldn't get there, and
Yeah.
it took me years.
Yeah. Yeah. To back up a little, when you said, hey, have you ever thought about doing something metal? When he asked you that, I picture you from that scene in Anchorman where they're asking Ron to play jazz flute. He's like, oh,
Right.
I couldn't. And he pulls the flute out of his
He's
sleeve.
like perfect. Like he just nails flute,
Yeah.
Yep, I remember that well. But
So,
that was a great experience.
well, that's awesome, man. That's great. That's a great story too. Like, it,
The way it happened was so organic, Like
yeah.
when Mark asked me if I would do something more rock, and we were just ready. But it just shows you how, how thinking ahead is such a big deal because, like it all falls apart if I don't have something to show him because then
Yeah.
it's like weeks or days or whatever between conversations and we're reminding each other what were we talking about and
Yeah.
blah blah blah, and we made it just very tangible and concrete by showing him something.
Exactly. You always got to be prepared, especially in this industry when you're doing something creative like that. You got to be prepared. You can't just tell anyone like, hey, I want to write a book. Well, you got like you showed up
Yeah.
with,
Well, I hate to say it this way, and I don't apply this to every situation, and definitely not the Metallica situation. But I learned a long time ago, and I don't remember if somebody said this to me or if I just said it to myself, which is you got to treat them like they're not that smart, and sort of like you got to show them things. You can't rely on explaining things to people
yeah,
because everybody's sort of reference point is different, and you don't know if they're having a shitty day or whatever, and you just like here it is the best thing you could do,
yeah, yeah,
and I think that's like bands demoing songs, like you could tell me how great it is all you want, but like until I hear it I can't possibly have an opinion. I'll just maybe be a little excited about hearing it.
yeah, right. You've co-authored several books. What's your approach to co-authoring to make the process go seamless?
Well, again, you know, I've approached everybody that I've done sort of these autobiographies with. So
Yeah,
whether it's HR from Bad Brains or Pete and Lou from Sick of It All or Vinny now, um, I've approached them. So I try to come with them with a like, here's why this is a good idea, and why I think people are going to really like it. Like Pete and Lou from Sick of It All, Lou especially, because he's just like a naysayer, was sort of like, why is anybody going to care about this, right? And I'm like, I had to come with information as to why I thought, people would care. I think Vinny is an obvious one. I think HR was an obvious one. Vinny Stigma is a book. He's like a walking, breathing,
oh
you know,
man,
telling of stories, right? And, and I've known him since 1984. So it's not, again, I didn't have to do a lot of research because I know him and his career so well. I worked with his band. I know everybody in the band. I know him. So, that again, it's preparation, but I didn't have to do a lot of preparation in that I sort of off the top of my head, I can set a tone with a few questions and then just sort of follow where it goes. Right.
yeah, yeah,
And, and I know, uh, I don't love to always do things in chronological order, but you kind of have to do that sometimes. It's the sort of like, what was your childhood like, and what was
exactly.
growing up in New York like, and what was it like being around the origins of punk rock here in the city where it was birthed, and all those things, and like those are some of the best stories. They really are, because then he started getting into, for instance, which again, I don't know where it's going to go sometimes. He starts talking to me about like all the real things that happened in Little Italy where he's grown up, and as it compares to like The Godfather, right?
Yeah.
So he's like, remember in The Godfather when the old mustache Pete, a thing I'd never heard before, old mustache Pete, pins the money on the thing. And I'm like, he goes, that was my saint. That's what people would do. And he goes, it was Saint Rocco. And he goes, in fact, the San Gennaro Festival was called the San Rocco Fest before it was San Gennaro. So I'm getting all this like incredible, like New
Yeah.
York history. And he's telling me like, the mystique of the roofs, in Little Italy, right? And that,
Yeah.
because you remember when De Niro was young Vito and he kills the Don and he goes up on the roof and he's jumping from roof to roof and he's throwing the gun parts in the chimneys. And he's like, yeah, the roofs were a big deal. He goes, my parents were married on two roofs because there wasn't enough room for the people. And we called it a football wedding because the people would make the sandwiches and we'd have to throw the sandwiches from roof to roof. And, hence the football, thing. And like, so he's just giving this incredible, like New York lore.
Yeah.
But again, you have to follow it. You can't plan it too much, and then, I interviewed him over 20 times. So it's something where, if we missed anything, whatever, we could just start, with the next one.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen Agnostic Front several times. Years ago, I worked at a club. I worked the door at a club in Dallas called the Galaxy Club, and they
I
came
remember
to
the
play.
Galaxy. Yeah.
They came to play there. I met the guys, but most recently, I think we share a friend, Danny Marianino.
Oh, sure.
Danny had
I have a quote on the back of his. He just did volume 2. That
yeah,
blows my mind. But the first one, I have a quote on the back.
yeah, and he recently did a book signing at Generation
Right,
Records,
Generation. Yeah.
and I went early because he did the show, Danny did this show, and then so I went early because we had never met in person. I hung out with him and his wife, and then Danny and Vinny walk in
Right.
to hang out. And so I was talking to Vinny, and I'm a huge Godzilla fan. We start
Mm,
talking about Godzilla, and he just starts spewing this knowledge about Godzilla. And I'm like,
yeah.
oh my God, to
Well,
me, that was awesome.
that
Talking
probably
to,
comes from his Bruce Lee love, because we would talk about one of his one of his two or three heroes, which you could see in the book, is Bruce Lee.
uh-huh.
And because he lived in Little Italy, had access to like seeing Bruce Lee stuff before he was such a big deal in America. Because all the Chinese kids he would hang out with, like, would have him come to his house and they would able to watch like, I don't know if it was like a Chinese illegal Chinese television or what it was, but he became real familiar, with Bruce Lee. So I'd have to imagine that Godzilla, because it was like the same time period, right? That you would
Yeah,
see
yeah, yeah, yeah,
certain channels on Saturday afternoons in New York on TV, right? So
yeah.
like when you were done with cartoons, there was like
Kung Fu
wrestling,
theater.
right, and then
Yeah,
wrestling, right,
yeah.
and
And then
Godzilla movies and things like
monster
that,
movies. Yeah,
right? So
yeah. So,
I'm not surprised that he's well versed in his Godzilla.
yeah, and I'm just sitting there, just having this First of all, I thought it was really cool that he was talking to me about it. You
Right.
know, and,
He'll, no offense, he will talk to anybody.
so the book, we'll get into that right now.
Yeah,
That's
sure.
uh, within 24 hours of you guys announcing it, it went to the Amazon bestsellers list, and it's not going to be released till
In a couple of categories too, like not
yeah,
just one. And so it was in 3 categories, and that was like, listen, you always hope for the best,
yeah,
right? You never know what's going to really happen, but we announced it, and I relied on my smarter, social media friends to like, what's the best day to announce some shit like this, And
yeah,
they're like, Monday at noon. I'm like, okay, like, why is that? And they're like, because you have most of the day on the East Coast, you have pretty much all the day on the West Coast, and you still have several hours in Europe. And in South America and all that, even before. But like, I was like, okay. So we announced it at noon, like on a Monday. and just social media really. From the social media, Blabbermouth picks it up as a press release, right?
Yeah.
And then I'd already spoken to Roger from Agnostic Front and be like, can you put this on the AF socials? And then he put it up about an hour later because he's West Coast. And then it just happened. Like, so, and I'm talking to my publisher. He's like, did you see all of a sudden, like there's all this activity? I'm like, yeah, I caused it. And so, because, like you're still doing a lot of stuff yourself.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, so every few hours, the Amazon rankings and stuff update. And he's like, watch. He goes, for the first few hours, it's going to go down, like it's going to go backwards. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah. And he's explaining why. So sure enough, it goes backwards. And then it jumps like several 100,000 places, right? It like when we started, the book is technically, I think it was about 1 million on Amazon. Like that was the rank. Um, and then it went from there to 10,000, right? And then you're like, okay, so a bunch of people bought the book in the last few hours. Like at least
Yeah.
you could tell that. I don't know the number. He knew the number, like about what it corresponds to, like with the ranking. And then 10,000 became 3,000. 3,000 became 1,000. And then suddenly it's like the, top 300 best-selling book on Amazon. And it's number one punk rock, number one metal, number one musician biography.
Yeah.
And so, but we were like jumping some pretty big titles, So, again, it's what you hope for, but you never
You
know.
don't expect it. Yeah.
Yeah, you
How did
can't.
that make him feel? I'm sure you were in contact with him.
He was sort of in shock. Like he sort of knows what that means, but he doesn't really know what that means,
Yeah.
But number one is something you can explain, right?
Yeah.
So that made it easier. So it wasn't like you're the 34th best-selling punk book, It wasn't like that.
Yeah.
That it went immediately from like not on the radar for anybody, to number one on the biggest retailer in America,
Yeah.
in 3 different categories. And again, it was like jumping, and every book that it jumped is a book that was out, So we did this as a pre-order, which was that was sort of a big surprise, that
Yeah.
it happened that quickly, and with the book, not coming out for months.
Yeah. Well, right on, man. You said you've known him since 84. 84. Was there anything new you learned about him?
I mean, I've been asked that before too, and I'm like, I'm not sure I learned anything new other than my chats with him reinforced a lot of things that you thought about him or you'd heard about him,
Yeah.
which is just that I'll use the old Yiddish term. We put it in the book. He's a fucking mensch. You know what I mean? Like he just is one of those salt of the earth, incredible people. And that probably points a lot to why he's been successful and why this band is still going,
Yeah.
40 years later. Um, he's like, he doesn't care about the dumb shit. You know what I mean? He cares only about like the band and putting on the best show possible and never letting fans down and like never coming off as a phony. He talks about it in the book where he's like, I would just never want anyone to be like, oh, that asshole rock star. Like he wasn't nice to me at one of our shows, or, I asked him to
Yeah.
sign something and he was a dick, or like, he's like, I live in a way that I don't ever want that to happen, whether it's 40 years later, whether it's the beginning of, the band, So
Yeah.
he tells a story about what happened. He got like hit with a bottle or something like that and was bleeding out of his head, like right before an AF show, like really early on. It's like 83, 84. And Roger's like, well, we just, I'm going to go to the hospital with you. He goes, you can't come to the hospital with me. Then you guys can't play. And he's like, what do you mean we can't play? Like you're bleeding out of your head, and like all this stuff. And he's like, no, you have to play. If I can get back here in time, I'll get back here in time, but just play. However, like just get one of our friends to get up there and just play fucking guitar, play covers. I don't care what you do,
Yeah.
but you have to
play.
play.
Yeah.
And so that's like where he's coming from, and you hear all these stories. And again, it goes back to like me meeting him in 84. I was a fan. I had Victim in Pain, and I was like, holy fuck, like this is life-changing, as far as I'm concerned, from a local band, which is
Yeah.
really how you viewed Agnostic Front at the time, right? They weren't really touring the world or anything like that. And everybody has a story like this. And I wrote it in my introduction in the book where, if I had a dime for every time someone said, the first time I went to CB's, I met Stigma, you know? And, my experience was I was there with some friends that he kind of knew, right? And so he's like, hey, you here to see the show? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, good, I'll see you inside. You know what I mean? It was like,
Yeah.
but just the fact that like, and it wasn't an AF show. It was just the first time I went to a matinee at CB's. Um, and he was just the welcoming committee.
Yeah.
And he did that for so many people. And he's a big reason why metalheads got accepted there, because he was just like, all are welcome. Like, this thing's tiny. Like, what we do is tiny.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to come here, like, for the right reasons and support this, fucking come one,
The
come all.
more the merrier, right?
And
Yeah.
like, fuck the long hair, short hair, bullshit. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, if you like Motley Crue, if you're coming here again, like, inspired and for all the right reasons, let's go, like, join us.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, to go back to that day that we had that conversation, there was no music talk, no talk of the band. We were just talking about something completely off topic. And he made me feel like we'd known each other for years. Two cats just having a conversation.
That's how he is.
Yeah. And
And,
I felt when I left, I was like, I think we're friends.
yeah, right, right. And he'll fucking remember you next time
Yeah.
too, which is what's even crazier. He's 68
Yeah.
years old. He shouldn't have memory that's that good. But it's another thing with his book where, because of his personality and because of me knowing that,
Yeah.
and understanding that, I was like, we have to like break the mold a little bit of these like punk rock biographies, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a lot of them coming out. A handful are good, some are garbage. Like, they don't even talk about like, what you'd want to hear as a fan. They shy away from things and all that. But he again he's lived such an interesting life. So the first thing we had, the title, I was like, Vinny, we have to call this the most interesting man in the world. And from the Dos Equis,
Yeah.
commercial, obviously. And he's like, love it, right? And then I ran it by a few people that we're friends with, and they're like, best title ever, like, for him, it's great.
Yeah.
And I was like, but we have to, again, we can't just do this chronological order of Vincent Capuccio's life. Like, that's not the book. We have to cover that. And I don't want to cover everything Roger covered in his book about Agnostic Front, because he did such a great job, I thought, covering the band.
Yeah.
But everything that led up to the band, because Vinny's the founder.
Yeah.
And I was like, let's really talk about everything that happened prior, like all your musical escapades and like all that stuff. And then, having Agnostic Front and meeting Roger and talking about, how you even got him in the band and, all those things. And then it just started expanding, like our brains were exploding with, because he cooks, right? So I was
Yeah.
like, we got to put recipes, right? I was like, there's people who look at you as like a superhero. So there's got to be a comic.
Yeah.
And then
The wrestling.
right. Then the wrestling stuff. And then I wrote a children's story about a boy from Little Italy with a big nose who like gets teased, and he wins all the kids over by playing guitar for them. And he told me when I showed him the children's story the first time, he goes, I fucking cried. He
Oh
goes,
man.
because he's like, it really feels like my story.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any reference other than like he made fun of his nose a few times in our interviews, right? He's like, me, Ray Capo from Youth of Today, like we all have the Italian noses, like, and so he gets into that. So it's like, so we wrote a children's story called The Nose, right? And so there's all this different stuff in the book. We got Ernie from Token Entry, Black Train Jack, who's a great illustrator to illustrate the comic. And, it's basically called Stigma Man. And it's like, he's a superhero who like, he's just trying to get to CB's and all this shit happens. And he has to like eradicate hipsters. And he has to like, he walks a lady across the street and he saves a puppy from a burning building and like, all this stuff. And we just started riffing. We just were coming up with stuff,
Yeah.
and we're like, I don't want it to be a book that has to be like start to finish
Yeah.
read, like you're lost in chapter 3 if you didn't read the first 2. And you could read any chapter and it's like its own thing. And the way we named the chapters was we called each chapter something that people consider stigma to be, right? So everything is like son, New Yorker, musician, which has 3 parts, father, wrestler, dancer,
Yeah.
cook, everything, right?
Yeah.
And so that's how we laid out the book. So I personally kind of modeled it a little bit after the Beastie Boys book, that giant 600-page
Yeah.
Beastie Boys book, where you could pick it up and look at any chapter and just be entertained by it. And you didn't need to, you can make it, you could read it however you want,
Yeah. 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 Well, I'll ask you this: do you think there was anything that he held back, or was anything afterwards that he asked you, "Hey, let's not, maybe not. We shouldn't put that in there."
I mean, the only thing he really was hesitant to talk about, and he really just directed me to someone else, was like, was the crew, the whole DMS crew thing.
Okay.
And he was just like, it's not my story to tell. You know what I mean? It's not like, he goes, obviously it's a part of my life and it's something that I'm involved in. He goes, but there's a lot of people involved in this and it's a very different animal. And I think if you didn't understand it and you were to read it, like, again, you wouldn't get it in the way that I wish people would understand it and get it.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should include that. Right.
Yeah.
And he goes, maybe talk to Freddie from Madball about that. Cause I'd done articles about them for some tattoo magazines and stuff like that. And Freddie talked about the concept of hardcore crews and like where they formed this and why they formed it. And they formed it like as a, out of a need a little bit, because at the end of the day, like, hardcore was in a very fucked up place for a while, right? There were Nazis involved. There was stuff going on. And that's where the brotherhood shit came to be outside of hardcore itself, right?
Yeah.
So that was really the only thing he didn't want to talk about that much. I mean, so one thing I learned, let's say, is I didn't know he had a cancer thing, like a cancer scare.
Oh, wow.
So he talked about that, which I wasn't aware of, and, he talks about at the time he was going through it, he was going on the road with Hatebreed as just like hanging out. And like, they used to like make fun of him, because of it. And he was like, it was kind of a funny, like moment, but he was sick, he actually got sick, but he's been doing great for a while. I mean, he's in better shape now than I ever remember him to be in. Like, he has like tiny amounts of body fat. He eats great. Like, he exercises.
He looked great at the
still
signing.
better than me.
Yeah. Will there
So
be
I learned that. I did learn.
Yeah. Once the book is released, will you guys be doing any signings around, or any like a book tour or anything?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go too far with the tour part of it, but we're definitely going to do some events. But what's crazy is right around the time of the book, AF has a very heavy touring schedule. So they're going to be. They just announced that Sepultura obituary run that they're doing from like I think it's like the 3rd week of September until the 2nd week of October. So he's not even home until 2 days after the book actually drops. So what my dream book thing in a New York event was going to be was to do the roast of Vinny Stigma.
Oh, man.
And make that the book signing and doing it at like a live venue,
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we really do feel that some people are not going to be able to handle it, because the roaster roasts, the person, and then the person's going to roast them back. And he goes, I hate to say it. He goes, but I think there's people who can't handle it. Like, we're going to get mad, and then it's on the internet. Like, Vinny Stigma said fucking blah, blah, blah about this person or that person. And I'm like, like, because we really wanted to do it. So what I think we're going to do for New York is we're going to do at least one screening of the Godfathers of Hardcore movie and do the book signing there, like at the theater. So we did some stuff like that with HR with his documentary, and we did book signings like after the screening was over, and it went great. So I think we're going to do something like that. We have some other ideas, like just like more fun, like intimate kind of things. Like we were like have Stigma make you a cappuccino, like doing it at a cafe or something like that, and like you're eating like biscotti and fucking cappuccinos, and
Yeah.
Stigma's making it for you. But we've gotten interest from like DC and Boston, and the Punk Rock Museum in Vegas. So we're going to try to do all these things.
Yeah.
It's a matter of scheduling now because again, AF has this touring schedule. Like 2 weeks after they come back from this run with Sepultura and Obituary, they're going back to Europe with Murphy's Law, and they're in Europe now. It's
Yeah.
for those who are watching this at their leisure. It's October. What? No, sorry. It's June 17th today, right?
Yeah.
And so they're there for like another couple of weeks, and then they come back. And I think they have a bunch of the summer off. But as far as the book release being October 10th, we're just trying to fit it all in, to be honest.
Right on, man. Right on. We'll be there, man. We'll help you promote it.
Yeah, it'll be fun. And like again, it's just celebratory. Like, Vinny Stigma did a friggin' book. How do you not celebrate?
I know. And that cover photo for the book is awesome, man.
It's perfect. And
he looks like a superhero.
Well, that's it, right? Like he looks like he's about to fly out the window. And that photo was taken by an excellent photographer in Massachusetts named Heather McGrath, and she came down to New York when they were making the Godfathers of Hardcore documentary with Ian McFarlane, and so she just did a photo shoot with him in his apartment, and I'd seen it online, just like just some random like Instagram post of it. I'm like, fuck, that's the cover, and so. I contacted her, and I think she was in like Africa when I contacted her. It was like actually tough to get in touch with her for a minute. She's like a super, a real working photographer who travels and photographs things. And she was like, I'm honored, like, let's do it. She honestly offered to do it for free. I'm like, not a chance.
Right on, man.
We can't do that.
Well, this book's coming out. Do you have anything in your head for your next project?
Yeah, working on a couple of ideas. The most immediate one is I was sort of like really into doing another children's book.
Yeah.
To like even out the autobiographies with the children's books and make it 5. But I wanted to do like because it's crazy. Like Caves and I were an inch away from doing 2 things. One, we were close to doing a Red Hot Chili Peppers alphabet book. And then we were also really close to doing a Rage Against the Machine alphabet book, which we were negotiating it, like doing it.
Yeah.
And then that's when they shut down their whole fucking thing and just said, we're not doing anything. Like when they sort of announced they're not going to do any more tour. They're not making up that tour they canceled, all that stuff. And the Chili Peppers, like COVID happened. And they were preparing the world tour that they only just did like a year ago.
Yeah.
And an album. And so all of it went on hold. Everything stopped, for quite a while. They didn't like get that stuff out and get on the road for about 3 years, after COVID. So it was just like, we can't think about anything else. They were all into it. We did a Flea page, and all that stuff. So we were ready to go. So long story short, I was like, you know what, let me do like a more quote unquote, proper children's book, right? So I wrote something called The Kids Table, which is about the Thanksgiving, like trials and tribulations of like a child being sent to the kids table.
Yeah.
Like you're the age now, like you can't sit with us parents anymore. You have to go to the kids table, and like the kids' adventure with like not wanting to go, hating his cousins at the table because they're disgusting, like wanting to go back to the parents, but all they do is talk about politics and money, and then sort of, realizing that the kids' table is kind of cool. Yeah. So I was like, and I had an idea in my head of the images, like how it would be illustrated. So I reached out to Ernie, who did Stigma's comic, who I worked with Black Train Jack, and I was a fan of with Token Entry and like all that stuff. And I was like, here's the deal. I'm going to send you this. Tell me if you want to work together. So he was totally into it. He sent me the first drawing, which was the first time I even saw characters that I had in my head. I was like, you fucking nailed it. It's like dad and a wife. It's very like Astoria, Queens. It's like dad and a wife beater. The mom just looks like she just got off the slipcover couch, you know what I mean? And like all that stuff. And a grandmother. And he just killed it. So we're taking our time with the illustrations, but that's what I'm immersed in right now.
Right on,
But
man.
I've got some other things up my sleeve.
Right on, man. Right on. Where can people find you online and information about Vinny's book?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm on, I think all the socials really. I don't go to TikTok much. That's for
That
my
was my
daughter
next
to.
question. I was like,
That's for my daughter to use. But
do
like,
you dance around on TikTok?
yeah, I try not to. I think there might be one dance out there from like when my daughter was about 7 or 8, and like, she made us do a TikTok dance, right? Because every parent must do one. Um, but like Instagram, Facebook, like, all of that, and it's like it's depending on which one. It's either you could always find me by name, but like, it's either How Nice 212 or How Nice, and How Nice being my hip hop name. But you could always find that. Like I post a lot of Stigma stuff, so you can find a lot of it there. Again, it's available all over the place right now for pre-order. So Amazon has it for pre-order. Generation not only has it up for pre-order, Generation Records, they have a big cartel site on linked to their website, and they're pre-ordering for signed copies. So like if you live in Kansas and you're not going to be able to get to a book signing or CNAF show anytime soon,
Yeah.
they're doing that. And then Cortex in Germany has it. And then also now Revelation Records, which is Rev HQ, just put it up for pre-order a few days ago. So you can get it. I urge you not to miss it. It's a fun one.
Yeah. Well, man, congratulations on all that. Like when I saw you post it up on your Facebook, like that hit everyone out of nowhere.
No, I think there was, I think I took for granted. I felt like a lot of people knew.
Yeah.
I realized very quickly how many people did not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you always have to remember, like, we live in a world this big, and
Yeah.
the rest of the world is this big, and so it's it's a whole thing. We haven't even talked about the Texas connection in a way, because like you spent all that time there, and like I signed Bowling for Soup, so
Oh,
it's
did you?
yeah, so it's like that's like my Texas connection. Not that I hadn't been there before,
Yeah.
but like I spent a lot of time in like the Dallas, Denton,
That's where I
Falls
lived for several
area.
years. Denton.
Denton's, because Denton's kind of cool because it's a college town, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Two
the first
universities.
time, the first time I saw them play was essentially at the University of North Texas, and it was them and the Nixons,
Yeah.
right? So so I've met Zach Malloy, who I know you've had on the show, and like he's a co-writer of Jarrett's for like quite a long time,
Yeah.
and so it's made me incredibly fond of that area of Texas, that
Yeah.
connection, like very close with those guys, and we worked our asses off to get somewhere.
Yeah. So you knew Jeff Rowe.
Oh, that was my boy.
Yeah.
And I have so many Jeff Rose stories, like the two that I'll think of is that he used to smoke weed in the shower, which is fucking hysterical. I don't
Yeah.
know how he kept it lit. And then two is just his undying love for Pantera, who I sort of can't stand as a fan. And so he loved Pantera, and he would like if we were doing a Bowling for Soup thing where hotels were involved, he and I would room up, and then also he would stay at my house. And
Yeah.
he's a guy who would put headphones on and fucking blast Vulgar Display of Power on 11, like where you had to be listening to it too. And he knew I wasn't a fan. And so I'm like in a hotel room at like 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, and he's fucking listening to Pantera to go to sleep. and then he falls asleep and it's still going, you know? So I would be the one who had to turn off the like iPod at the time and be
All
like,
right.
oh, I can't listen to this. I've heard the album 3 times already. Like
Yeah.
tonight.
Several years ago, someone tagged me in a photo with him, and it's the only photo I have with him, but it's on my Facebook way back, But
We we did a lot of stuff together. We did a lot
he,
of damage. We traveled the world together in a
yeah,
way, and like went to a lot of places for the first time together, which was fun. And
yeah,
like I helped distract his soon to be wife at the time while he went and bought a ring with Bowling for Soup's publicist, like in
yeah.
in England. Um, what a fucking great guy, like just pure. I
Jeff
wish I
was.
knew him. I wish I knew him more as a musician too, because like I know
Yeah,
what a musician. He went to University of North Texas, for like trombone, basically,
yeah.
right?
That's how I met him. He was in a band called Beef Jerky
Right.
in Denton, and I started going to see them, became friends with all those guys, still friends with a lot of them to this day. But that's how and then he started managing BFS,
Yeah.
and we've been trying to get Jared on this show for a while, but the guy is just so busy, you know.
Well, yeah, because their schedule is crazy. I mean,
They're in
he's in
Europe
Europe
right
now
now.
too,
Yeah,
and I'm assuming you heard, Chris fell
yeah, it
ill
was in the hospital.
and
Yeah,
he wound up coming home. So they played freaking Download Festival without him.
as a three piece.
As a
Yeah,
3 piece, which I'm sure they could pull off. And apparently
yeah,
it went great. But I've been to Download, and that's fucking intimidating. Yeah, it's 60,000 people.
yeah,
And they had like a prime slot with like all 60,000 people there already, If you play early in the day, like you might
yeah,
play to 25,000 people. But like,
yeah.
and I feel like they did an acoustic set on a side stage too or something.
Yeah. I
And
saw the
then
photos. It looks insane.
it's insane. And like,
Yeah.
and again, that used to be the Donington Festival, which as a
Yeah.
kid, like a metal kid, growing up, like you were like, oh, I can't wait to go to Donington, like one day. And I finally got to go. Like I didn't get to go till like 96. And I didn't see them at Donington, but I've seen Bowling for Super at Reading, which was
Yeah.
another one. So
Yeah.
Reading and Leeds, which is basically the same show, but two different locations a
Yeah.
day apart. And I got to see Bowling for Soup play Reading, which was incredible. I mean, I saw them play clubs in England before they really, really blew up. And that was mind blowing that they were selling out like the London Astoria, like 1,200 people.
Yeah.
And I was like, what the fuck is going on here? And like it took, that happened first before they got on the radio in America. And so to go over, and I've had this experience with bands I worked with at Roadrunner too, where like you go over the Atlantic or whatever and see these bands just starting to blow up, and you're like,
Yeah.
how is this happening? And then you start to learn like how small these places are. Like England is
Yeah.
tiny, and
Yep.
so to penetrate the whole country between a little magazine coverage and the BBC, all of England hears you in like 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And Kerrang and all that stuff that I was reading as a kid still there, and like,
Yeah.
and you could read about your favorite bands in like a timely fashion. I mean, the internet has taken that over a little bit, but it's just incredible. And to watch them, out of Wichita Falls, Texas, and like spending time in Denton, and then, people caring about them in Dallas, and then, like, oh, Austin cares a little bit now, and
Yeah.
then, so Texas happens, and then some radio station in Indianapolis plays a song, and it just happens. Like it just
Yeah. They
all like
just
you can't
people.
plan it, you can't whatever, and you just
Yeah.
step in shit, and it just keeps going.
Yeah. Well, I know. I would say like everyone was proud of them, because
Yeah.
they went out and represented Texas.
Oh my God, Jarrett's guitar is the flag of
Yeah.
the fucking state. And he has like offshoots of it now, right? He has like
Yeah.
not just the one, I think he has others.
Yeah.
But then, like I said, I met like a Zach Malloy, and I met, people like who were, involved in that world. And like I'd heard of the Nixons and I heard a couple of songs, but then, I realized what they meant to Texas,
Yeah.
um, and things
Good
like
days.
that. And like I know what it looks like to mean something to New York,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to see that. And then, even at the time, like the first time they played South by Southwest, like 7 people cared, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and then you come back a year later and it's like they're begging them to headline a show. And, I'm like, man, this is just, this is on autopilot at this point. Like you can't stop this train, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It was a good time. It was a different time.
And these other bands were popping up out of Texas at the time, like, you know, some who did okay and some, you know, didn't do much of anything, but like
Yeah.
there was some quality, there was an eye on Texas, you know, for a
Yeah,
minute.
for a while there,
Dallas,
after
especially.
Drowning Pool, Edgewater was around, Brutal Juice,
Right,
Tomorrowland,
right,
the Tomorrow People. What
right,
was it?
right,
Tomorrow
right.
People? Yeah. Anyway, but those bands, you know, they were all doing great. It was a good scene, man, for the and it's, you know, that scene is really thriving right now.
And it's hard to do with the kind of music that a lot of these bands were because they were rock bands. Like it wasn't like an underground scene, let's say, right? It was
No.
sort of like, you know, like specialty radio and live, you know,
Yeah.
and that was kind of it. Like that's how you got, you know, recognized.
Yeah.
And you know, I'll never forget like the whole bitch song thing with Bowling for Soup, where you know it got played on that Dallas, you know, alternative station on the specialty show, and it was like a smash or trash kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it like won every fucking night. Like it was sort of a joke, you know, to the point where like who are they gonna beat this week, you know? And like, but they were beating like Nine Inch Nails and like shit like
Yeah.
that. And you were like, and I guess the station told them like we need to retire it because it's just stupid at this point, you know,
Yeah.
like it's never gonna lose. Like that's part of the joke now at this point. Like, you
Yeah.
know, like people are gonna go crazy to make sure it beats whatever's next, you
Yeah.
know? And you know, and that's the first song I heard, you know, and just it all, you know, and I met Fro like, you know, by accident.
Yeah. Well, like I said, he was a good dude, you know.
Great dude, one of my favorites ever. I
Yeah.
miss him immensely.
Yeah. There's not a person you'll meet that knew him that won't reiterate those words, you know.
That's right. And then I remember Jarrett getting to introduce him to Dimebag. Like that was a whole other thing, like where they wound up playing together on some festival.
Yeah.
And so they finally got to like, you know, Fro got to meet his hero, you know? And so I'm so happy that that happened, you know?
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Well, Howie, I appreciate you taking the time to do this today. I've got one more question for you, man.
Yeah.
Our podcast, it's called Is Breakfast Included? If we're having breakfast, which I hope we do, what would you have?
Oh man. Um, you know what? I'm of two different directions, right? So I'm a vegetarian, so I don't eat meat. So there's no like bacon or any of that stuff. I don't even like, and I like plant-based stuff, but I don't like the plant-based breakfast meat stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm an egg guy, so I can do like I can make a nice omelet, you know.
Uh-huh.
And I like toast because I'm a bread freak. Thank you, diabetes. And then, you know, so then, but I also sometimes I go through these phases where I'll do like the Greek yogurt and fruit and granola thing.
Yeah.
So right now I'm back on eggs. You know, I love the omelet concept,
Yeah.
but yeah, breakfast is included.
The omelet and toast.
Yeah, I'm a fan, you know, and I'll do, you know, and from the South, spent enough time in the South, like with those guys recording in Georgia, that I love grits.
Yeah, I'm still not a grit guy.
Fucking love it. And cheese grits are
Yeah.
impeccable.
Yeah, I'm still not a grit guy.
Love them. There's a place up here, like one of my favorite diners, that on the weekends they offer grits.
Right on,
And
man.
I'm like, every time, like if I go to the diner, like with my family or something, it's like grits instead of potatoes, please, you know?
Well, Howie, it was good talking to you, man. I appreciate your time, and I hope we get together soon.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks for reaching out. You're in Jersey, right?
Yeah, Jersey City.
All right. Well, we'll certainly meet at Vinny's event, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And, if not before and or after.
Right
So
on,
thank
brother.
you again.
All right, man. Take care.
All right, you too.
Right on. Howie Abrams. Told you were going to dig it. Can you imagine sitting down with Vinny Stigma and him telling you his entire life? I bet he left out some things because he just can't remember. He's done so many cool things. You can follow Howie at HowNice212 on Instagram. Make sure you pre-order your copy of Vinny Stigma, the most interesting man in the world. Follow Agnostic Front. Follow Generation Records. Just support all these artists. And while you're online, check out isbreakfast.com and see what we have to offer. I mean, we're pretty cool ourselves in our own right. I'd like to think so. Maybe not up there with Vinny Stigma, but I don't know. We're kind of cool. All right, guys, I am done. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next week.